The date is June 8, 1809. The location, Greenwich Village, New York. It's raining. A small wooden coffin is being loaded onto a wagon. Inside the box is the body of a 72-year-old man who died alone, broke, and miserable. The driver snaps the reins and the wagon begins the long, muddy trek up to a farm in New Rochelle. Now, usually when a founding father dies, the country stops. When Washington died, there were mock funerals held in every city across the country. The Army wore black armbands for 6 months. Even the British Navy lowered their flags. When Franklin died, 20,000 people showed up to the procession. But for the man in this wagon, there are no flags. There are no soldiers. There are no politicians. There are 6 mourners. 2 of them are French, 1 is a Quaker, and 2 of them are black men who walked 25 miles just to pay their respects to the man who was the first among the founders to call for the abolition of slavery. That's it. The man in the box is the person who literally invented the phrase, the United States of America. He is the man who wrote the words that convinced the soldiers to freeze at Valley Forge. He is the man who drafted the intellectual blueprint for the modern world. But when his friends asked the Quakers, the pacifist, gentle Quakers, if he could be buried in their cemetery, they said no. They didn't want his bones polluting their ground. So they buried him in a hole on his farm under a walnut tree. This isn't a funeral, it's a disposal. How does this happen? How do you go from being the voice of the revolution to a pariah that the country wants to forget? You do it by committing the one unforgivable sin in American politics. Thomas Paine told the truth about the church. You are listening to False Foundation. I'm Jim. We are told that the United States was founded by Christians for Christians based on Christian principles. But if that's true, why did the Founding Fathers erase the man who started the whole thing? Today, we are opening the file on the American heretic. We are looking at the life, the death, and the deliberate erasure of Thomas Paine. Let's move out. To understand the crime, you have to understand the height from which he fell. If you went back to 1776 and asked a random person on the street who the most important man in America was, they wouldn't say George Washington. They would say Thomas Paine. Washington was the sword of the Revolution. Jefferson was the pen. But Paine? Paine was the voice. Before Paine arrived in 1774, the American Revolution was just a tax dispute. It was a bunch of wealthy lawyers and merchants arguing about stamp duties. They didn't want independence. They wanted a better deal with the king. Paine shifted that mindset entirely. He looked at the situation and realized that the problem wasn't the tax, the problem was the monarchy. When he published Common Sense, he did something that no one had ever done before. He democratized political language. Before Paine, politics was written in Latin or legalese. It was written by elites, for elites. Paine wrote for the guy in the tavern. He wrote for the blacksmith. He took the high-minded philosophy of the Enlightenment and turned it into a weapon. We talked in the last episode about the numbers. 120,000 copies sold in 3 months. But the numbers don't really capture the vibe. John Adams, who famously hated Paine because Adams was a snob, admitted this. He said, without the pen of the author of Common Sense, the sword of Washington would have been raised in vain. I want to pause on John Adams for just a second because his hatred of Paine explains everything about what happened later. Adams was a revolutionary, yes, but he was also an elitist. He believed that government should be run by the well-born. He looked at Paine, a corset maker with dirt under his fingernails, and he was disgusted. In a letter to a friend, Adams called Paine a mongrel between a pig and a puppy, begotten by a wild boar on a bitch wolf. That is how the establishment founders viewed him. They liked his output, but they hated his class. Benjamin Franklin, the other working-class genius of the group, he saw it differently. Franklin told Paine, quote, "You are more responsible than any other living person on this continent for the creation of what are called the United States of America," end quote. Again, that was Benjamin Franklin. Franklin understood what Adams didn't. You can't have a revolution without the people. And Paine was the only one who spoke their language. In Common Sense, Paine wrote a sentence that broke the brain of every aristocrat in Europe. He wrote, quote, "In America, the law is king. For an absolute government, the king is the law. So in free countries, the law ought to be king, and there ought be no other." End quote. This is the moment the secular republic was born. Paine took the crown off the head of the monarch and placed it on an idea. He argued that the authority doesn't come from the divine right of a bloodline. It comes from the consent of the governed, codified in law. If the law is king, then God is not the political head of state. The people are. Think about that admission. John Adams, the second president of the United States, explicitly stated that the war would have been lost without this man. And he wasn't wrong. In the winter of 1776, when the army was disintegrating, when Washington was losing every battle, it was Paine who sat by a campfire and wrote The American Crisis. Quote, "These are the times that try men's souls. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will, in this crisis, shrink from the service of their country." End quote. Washington ordered that essay read to every single regiment. It stopped the desertions. It saved the army. Thomas Paine didn't just write about America, he willed it into existence. He gave all the royalties from his books to the Continental Army. He served in the trenches. He was the pure, distilled essence of the revolution. So, why isn't he on the nickel? Why is there no Paine Memorial on the National Mall? Because Paine made a fatal miscalculation. He thought that because we had rejected the tyranny of the king, we were ready to reject the tyranny of the bishop. He was wrong. After the American War was won, Paine didn't retire to a farm like Washington. He was a revolutionary by trade. So he went to France to help them do the same thing. But the French Revolution wasn't like the American one. It was messy, it was bloody, and eventually the chaos turned on him. In December of 1793, Thomas Paine was arrested by the Jacobins, the extremists running the French government. He was thrown into Luxembourg prison. The irony here is sickening. The man who wrote the book on liberty was locked in a dungeon by the Friends of Liberty. He knew he was going to die. The guillotine was working overtime. Prisoners were being hauled out by the dozen every morning, and Paine's name was on the list. There is a legend, and historians argue about the details, but Paine swore it was true, that the executioners actually came for him one night. They marked the doors of the condemned with chalk, but Paine's door happened to be open at that time, swung outward against the hallway wall. The guard marked the inside of the door rather than the wall. When the door was shut for the night, the chalk mark was facing into the cell. The executioners walked right past him. He survived because of a geometry error. But while he sat in that cell, waiting for the blade, he decided to write his last will and testament. He didn't have any money to leave. It was invested in the American Revolution. He had thoughts. He wanted to leave the world his final verdict on God. He asked for a pen and paper, and he wrote, The Age of Reason. Now, the Christian nationalist will tell you that this is an atheist manifesto. It isn't. Paine was a deist. He believed in a creator. In the very first chapter, he writes, I believe in one God and no more, and I hope for happiness beyond this life. That doesn't sound like an atheist to me. So why was the book so dangerous? Because Paine didn't attack God. He attacked the Bible. He argued that the Bible wasn't the word of God, it was the word of men. Men who were using revelation to control other men. He went through the Old Testament like a lawyer dissecting a fraudulent contract. He pointed out the contradictions, the cruelties, and the scientific impossibilities. He famously wrote, My own mind is my own church. He was arguing that you don't need a priest to talk to the Creator. You have your own reason. You have the natural world. That is the only Bible you need. To the political establishment, this was nuclear. In 1794, you could get away with criticizing a king, but you could not get away with cutting out the middleman between a man and his God. Paine was eventually released from prison, but not by Washington, his brother-in-arms. Washington was a politician now and unwilling to risk political capital on Paine. It was Monroe who would come to his rescue. And let's look at the details of that betrayal, because it's colder than you think. Paine was rotting in Luxembourg prison. He was sick. He had an abscess in his side that was killing him. He was watching his friends get dragged to the guillotine every day. He wrote to Washington. He begged for help. And he said, quote, "I am an American citizen. You know me. I serve with you. Claim me, and they will let me go." End quote. Washington received those letters, and he did nothing. He let the author of the crisis rot because Washington was negotiating a treaty with Britain, the Jay Treaty, and he didn't want to annoy the British by saving a radical like Paine. So who saved him? James Monroe, the future fifth president of the United States, was the ambassador to France at the time. When Monroe found out Paine was alive, he didn't check with Washington. He marched to the prison. He told the French government, quote, "The citizens of the United States can never look back to the era of their own revolution without recollecting among the names of their most distinguished patriots that of Thomas Paine." End quote. Monroe bullied the French into releasing him. And then, and this shows you the character of the man, Monroe took the sick, broken Paine into his own home in Paris. He and his wife nursed Paine back to health for more than 18 months. Monroe risked his career to save the heretic. Washington protected his poll numbers. That is a contrast that the history books tend to leave out. He returned to America in 1802. He expected a hero's welcome. He expected parades. He was the man who saved the revolution, remember? Instead, he walked into a buzzsaw of character assassination. While he was gone, the Federalists and the clergy had launched a coordinated campaign to destroy him. They knew they couldn't debate him. You don't debate Thomas Paine because you lose. So they attacked him. The newspapers called him a lying, drunken, brutal infidel. They claimed he beat his wife. He didn't. They claimed he died screaming in regret, begging Jesus for forgiveness. He didn't. He wasn't dead yet, after all. They called him the loathsome Thomas Paine. Mothers would cover their children's eyes when he walked down the street in New York. People stopped inviting him to dinner. The press painted him as a dirty, confused old man who hated America. They always go back to the hating America thing. And the silence from his friends was deafening. This is the part that breaks your heart. Paine returned to America expecting a reunion with his old commander. But Washington, who was now retired at Mount Vernon, refused to answer his letters. The father of the country had decided that Paine was a liability. Paine never forgave him. He wrote a letter to Washington that effectively ended their friendship, saying, "As to you, sir, treacherous in private friendship, and a hypocrite in public life, the world will be puzzled to decide whether you are an apostate or an impostor." Yeah, he didn't mince words. But the smear campaign worked. It worked so well that it lasted for 100 years. In 1888, Theodore Roosevelt, a man who prided himself on being a historian, wrote a biography of Gouverneur Morris. In that book, he dismissed Paine with 3 words. He called him a filthy little atheist. Think about the power of that lie. Teddy Roosevelt was smart, but even he had swallowed the programming. The Christian nation narrative was so strong by the late 19th century that it had successfully retconned history. They had turned the man who wrote the American scripture into a villain just to protect the sensitivity of the church. So, why does this matter? Why are we spending 30 minutes talking about a man who has been dead for 2 centuries? Because Thomas Paine is the smoking gun. The Christian nationalists rely on a specific version of history. They need you to believe that the Founding Fathers were a monolithic block of devout, Bible-believing Christians who intended to build a new Jerusalem. They need that narrative to be true. If it's true, then they can have a claim to the country. But Thomas Paine existed. You cannot tell the story of the American Revolution without him. You cannot explain 1776 without common sense. You cannot explain the survival of the revolutionary armor without the crisis. He is the ghost in the machine. And the fact that the soul of the revolution was a man who believed that the Bible was a fraud, that destroys their entire argument. Paine proves that the spirit of 1776 was secular. He proves that you can be a patriot without being a Christian. He proves that the United States was built on reason, not revelation. That is why they erased him. They didn't hate him because he was drunk or rude. They hated him because he was evidence. He was a glitch in their matrix that they couldn't explain, so they deleted the file. But here's the beautiful thing about history. The file is still there. We are the backups. Every time you refuse to be gaslit by a theocrat, you are channeling Paine. Every time you demand evidence instead of accepting dogma, you are channeling Paine. Every time you look at a divine right, whether it's a king, a bishop, or a Heritage Foundation policy paper, and you say, I don't think so, you are finishing the work he started. We don't need to build Thomas Paine a statue. We honor him by being what he was, the American heretic. We honor him by being the people who are willing to say the things that the religious right thinks are too radical. We honor him by refusing to let the known good of religion silence the plain truth of reality. Thomas Paine warned us. In the Age of Reason, he called the union of church and state an adulterous connection. He knew that when you mix religion and politics, you don't get a holy government, you get a weaponized church. And right now, in 2026, we are watching that weapon being loaded. But here's the twist that Paine might not have predicted. The people aiming the weapon aren't necessarily believers in the way you or I understand the word. They are operators. If you look at the current architecture of the White House, you see men like Stephen Miller. Miller isn't a theologian, he's a tactician. He understands what the Council for National Policy realized decades ago. Faith is the ultimate leverage. If you want to pass a tax cut for a billionaire, you can't run on, let's help the rich. You'll lose. But if you wrap that tax cut in a Bible verse, if you tell a working class family that the EPA is anti-Christian because it interferes with God's dominion over the earth, now you have a movement. This is the cynicism that defines the current moment. We aren't seeing a revival, we are seeing a transaction. Take a look at the money behind the curtain. Look at the Wilkes brothers, Ferris and Dan, the fracking billionaires from Texas. These are men who literally preach that climate change is impossible because God promised Noah he wouldn't flood the earth again. That is a convenient theology if you own a fracking company. The Wilkes brothers have poured millions into groups like PragerU and the Daily Wire to push a specific version of reality. They aren't paying for religious education, they are paying for a misinformation campaign. They are buying a generation of voters who are trained to view regulation as sin and environmental protection as heresy. And who is executing this vision? Look at the Religious Liberty Commission that was established by executive order. On the surface, it sounds noble. Who hates liberty? But read the fine print. This commission isn't designed to protect a Muslim woman's right to wear a hijab or a Sikh man's right to wear a turban. It's designed to create a legal loophole for discrimination. It's the mechanical solution for what the Heritage Foundation calls the conservative promise. The goal is to allow federally funded organizations, hospitals, adoption agencies, and schools to refuse services to gay couples or single mothers, or anyone who doesn't fit the biblical family mold, all while still cashing government checks. This is where Stephen Miller comes in. Miller understands that you can't just deport millions of people or dismantle the civil service with brute force alone. You need a moral cover. You need to frame cruelty as order. By partnering with the Christian nationalist machine, Miller and his ilk, people like Russ Vogt, the architect of Project 2025, had pulled off the greatest magic trick in American political history. They have convinced millions of decent church-going Americans that the only way to love God is to hate their neighbors. They have convinced them that freedom means the freedom to impose their specific theology on everyone else. And this is where the betrayal happens. The average evangelical voter in Ohio or Georgia isn't the villain here. They are the mark. They are the victims of a long con. They are being told that they're fighting a spiritual war for the soul of the nation. But in reality, they're just being used as human shields to protect the profit margins of a quiet oligarchy. They are voting for family values, but they are getting policies that poison their water, underfund their schools, and strip away their health care, all signed by a Christian prince who holds the Bible upside down. Thomas Paine saw this coming 250 years ago. He famously wrote, quote, "Persecution is not an original feature in any religion, but it is always the strongly marked feature of all law religions, or religions established by law." End quote. He knew that the moment you give a preacher a badge, you destroy the religion. The billionaires funding this movement, the Wilkes, the Dunns, the Princes, they know exactly what they're doing. They are betting that you are too polite to call it out. They are banking on the fact that we treat religion as off limits for criticism. But we can't afford to be polite anymore. We have to be heretics. We have to be willing to look at the Religious Liberty Commission and call it what it is, an inquisition with a public relations budget. The tragedy of 2026 isn't the wall between church and state has fallen, it's that it was sold for scrap metal by men who would sell the pews out from under their own congregations if the price was right. I told you at the beginning of the episode that Paine was buried in a hole on his farm because the Quakers wouldn't take him. But that isn't the end of the story. If it were, we could at least go visit his grave. But we can't, because Thomas Paine isn't there. 10 years after he died, a man named William Cobbett, a radical English journalist, decided that America didn't deserve Paine. Cobbett felt guilty. He had attacked Paine earlier in his life, and now, as a form of penance, he wanted to give him a hero's memorial in England. So in 1819, Cobbett went to New Rochelle in the middle of the night. He dug up the body. He put Thomas Paine's bones in a trunk and shipped them back to Liverpool. He planned to build a massive mausoleum. He wanted pilgrims to come and pay respects to the father of reason. But Cobbett ran out of money. The mausoleum was never built. For years, the bones of Thomas Paine sat in a trunk in William Cobbett's attic. When Cobbett died, his son didn't know what to do with them. The estate went bankrupt. The bones were seized as assets, and then they vanished. There are rumors. Some say that they were sold to a curiosity collector. Some say that his skull ended up in Australia. There's a story that his jawbone is in England. There are even rumors that buttons were made from his finger bones. The man who gave us our country is literally scattered to the winds. There is no body. There is no grave. There is no shrine to the author of common sense. And in a way, maybe that's perfect. Maybe it is fitting that the man who said, "My country is the world," has no final resting place in the soil of a single nation. Maybe it is fitting that the man who said, "My own mind is my own church," has no temple. They erased his reputation. They lost his body. But they could not kill the idea. Every time you read the Bill of Rights, you are reading Paine. Every time you vote, you are standing on his shoulders. He is the ghost in the machine of the Republic. And ghosts don't need graves. This has been False Foundation. If you learned something, tell a friend. If you got mad, tell me. You can email me at jim@falsefoundation.com. I read everything, even the hate mail. If you want to help us dig up more buried history, join the crew at patreon.com/falsefoundation. Thanks for listening.